Hello everyone, this is Caillou back here, and I'm joined by That Damn Pipsqueak for the second part of our review of her cube, Agonos Cube. We're going in color order, so this time we're going to be covering all of the blue cards in the cube. And before we started recording, Pip said that she had a hot take she wanted to start this episode off with, so I'm going to throw it over to her.
All right, so if you remember in the last episode we had I had three cards in S tier in white. One thing I was shocked to find out as I was kind of going through this process is I don't think there are any cards in blue that I would describe as S tier. There are no cards where if they're in a pack, I think you should look at them and go, oh, holy cow. This means blue is open, and also, like, I need to hard pivot to be able to play this card. There's plenty of cards that are really good in blue. Like, I think blue has substantially more A-tier cards than I did in white, but it just doesn't have any cards that I would point to and say, like, if this is in the pack, this means you should be in blue.
Interesting. I think I have one S tier card, but we'll talk about that when we get there.
I'm excited to hear it.
Mm. Yeah. Speaking of A tier, let's start off with our A cards. Aetherflash Expert. So, Aetherflash Expert says when this enters the battlefield, you may put a creature card from your hand on the battlefield. If you do, sacrifice it. And it also has Recite, which lets you cast it from your graveyard. I rank this as basically situational, but situational plus, in the sense of I think that this is basically, well, not only good, but I think you're mostly going to be playing this in a cheat out deck. But in that deck, as at 3 mana, it's one of your cheaper options. I think the having to sacrifice it part is a little iffy with some of the targets, but others, like Inexorable Vengeance or whatever, they just don't go away, so you're totally fine with that. Also, it costing 2 mana from the grave is also kind of disgusting, because it means that you can combo off multiple times, or you can surveil into this with a cantrip, etc., etc. So,
Yeah, there's definitely some really messed up things you can put into play with this, or just, like, even value ETBs that you can get. The kind of seed of this idea was just I wanted a flash, like the actual canon card that was playable in Cube, because I think that card is really cool, but generally kind of bad. I put this in. Sorry, I put this in C tier though. I think there's very few decks that want it, and it's good in the decks that both want it and get it, but I think that those are fairly small.
that's fair. And yeah, that's why I put the situational tag on there for me, because I feel a little weird about rating it C tier, even though, like, if you're looking at a pack, it's probably an objective thing. But if you're in this card's lane, I think it's a very solid pickup, basically.
Yeah. So the next one is Archvillain's Ploy. This card's really good. It's one, like, inarguable. This is generating card advantage, which is counterspell effect, plus 2 things that are situationally generating either tempo or sometimes card advantage, which is the flicker and the bounce. I think this card is a pretty clear-cut B tier card for me. It's fairly high in B as well. The fail case, of course, is since it fast flickers lands, is that it is a 3 mana counterspell that rebates you 1, so it's kind of a 2 mana counterspell. And it's the potential high value plays of this are really good, where you bounce an opponent's creature and you flicker a planeswalker or whatever.
Yeah, this is a card that I think this is surprising, because I tend to value this card pretty highly, but I had it a little bit lower in B tier. But I really like this card. It's one of the 2 counter spells which you can loop with Poliano Spellweaver. It's a little more expensive on that front than the other one we're going to talk about, but I like cards which take other cards that I want to pick and give more synergies to them. And I think that Archvillain's Ploy is one of those cards that's generically good, and then sometimes you just land into game-winning lock scenarios. It's like, okay, cool. Or even without that, you just end up with crazy value plays, like you mentioned. So
Yeah, I mean, if you're flickering a Archaeomancer type creature with this card is really gross.
Mm.
Um, so the next card is Astral Manipulation. Um, Astral Manipulation's a really basic control magic, and often control magics are seen as really good in cubes, but I think Agonos cube is a cube where so much of the value of creatures is tied to, like, ETBs often, or, like, deck specific synergies, that I think a removal spell that doesn't kind of negate any of those, or a mind control that doesn't, like, usually get benefits from cards where the value is there. I think this is a pretty clear cut C tier card for me, and honestly, I think there's a world in which it should be D tier, but that feels a little bit insane to say.
Interesting. For me, this is like low B tier, but most of that is off the back of I kind of don't know what decks you want this in, where it's like, like obviously like some blue controller mid-range thing, but I've never found myself going like, yeah, I want this in this deck. And I find like I cut it surprisingly often. And it's like, it's undeniably a powerful effect. It's just sort of weird with regard to the composition of the rest of the cube. I still think it's like, I'm still a fan of the effect. I think it's a B tier for me, but yeah, I agree. It's just in a weird spot. Next up, we have Astrolabic Wisdom. This is one of the bevy of 1-mana cantrips that we have in this cube, and it's a fairly simple one. You Surveil 2, and you draw a card. I think this is a fairly simple A for me. There are so many decks it goes in, it doesn't have high density, it's not like, or maybe it's weird in A, because I feel like the assumption I made with A is that like this makes you want to play that color, but I think it's A in the sense of like, it's just so flexible and so good to be able to have something that's cheap and gives you something to do in early in the game that gets you to your other cards. It's just, I mean, okay. I'm starting to go on a spiel about selling you on cantrips. Cantrips good. I think this is an A tier.
Yeah, for me, this is B tier. I can't think of a blue deck where you cut this card, but also, like, drafting this card isn't suddenly a reason to become blue. This card is very good, though. I think something that it slightly suffers from is the fact that it does kind of the same basic thing as two of the other, like, really powerful cantrips in this cube, so it's not providing a unique effect by virtue of being able to bin things. It's just also good at binning things. So, find answers, which we'll get to later, and I think the little next card we'll get to as well are also just cantrips that are very powerful in a graveyard deck.
Yeah, speaking of the next card, take it away.
Yeah, Bargain with Ryukami is 2 mana. It's not quite a cantrip. Sometimes it'll draw you 2 cards, or sometimes it'll draw you just the most important card. And the rest of them go to the bin, which is kind of sweet. So I think this is a card where this is actually better the more fair your deck is, which I think is kind of a funny spot to have a, cantrip slash draw spell in. This is like basically at the highest point in B tier for me, though. Again, this is not drafting this wouldn't make me want to go into blue, but there's basically no deck where I don't run this if I am in blue, and sometimes it'll pull me towards blue.
Got you. I think this is in low A for me, and I think that some of these rankings may seem like weird with regard to like the scale I set out last video. And I think that it might also be, and that might be influenced by like how often I personally tend to pick up these cards early, because I think that these are cards which are like you said, they're just, you never really cut them and they're super flexible. So I tend to find myself picking these up like semi early reasonably often.
Mhm.
And like I end up with a density of them where it's like, okay, now I'm in blue.
Yeah,
It,
that's
But I think the next one is one of the cards where it's A on the merits of definitely being, or for me, it's an A based on the merits of, oh yeah, I'm in blue now. And that's Break Reality. This is a card that I honestly didn't like, I didn't value super highly the first time, or like the first, like for a while when I would play this cube, because I'm like, it's 7 mana. Like, how are you getting there? I also mentally shortcutted in that it exiles itself, which it doesn't. Um, but really, it's pretty disgusting even at 7 mana, like, especially given the amount of rocks in the cube, etc., and like other ways to ramp into this. Um, it's just it's such a flexible and powerful win con in that if you can cast this, it's probably game over for your opponent. And there are also ways to assemble like loops/locks with it because it returns permanence to their. You can return something that like an Archaeomancer to your hand, and then like loop this.
Yeah, this is a card where I think just over time the people drafting Agonos Cube have gone just consistently higher and higher on it because I was similar. Um, it is one of the two like big blue win the game spells in the cube, and I think it's just a really catastrophically fucked up card where if you cast this, even if you're not doing like a weird looping thing with it, it's really hard to lose the game from that point. You bounce 3 lands and take an extra turn, good fucking luck. Or however it ends up being. It's usually going to be making its mana worth. But I think the card is also just really cool because the hoop of hit 7 mana isn't free. Like, there's plenty of blue decks that can't afford to play this. But on the other hand, I think this is a very strong reason to go into blue if you aren't already. So for me, this is an A. You shouldn't hard pivot off this card, but it is one of the reasons you play blue.
Makes sense. Next up, we have our second BHA of the cube. It's Brewing Hurricane Ancient. Its adventure is put target online permanent on the top of its owner's library. Pretty solid removal spell for blue, at least. The actual 6 mana creature itself, though, pretty powerful. It's a 5/5 flyer that whenever it attacks, you can return target instant sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. And hey, guess what? This is one of the ways to loop the aforementioned Break Reality. I think for me, this is a card where it's like, it's high B, where like, it's just so strong on the face of it. And I think that maybe as I do more drafts, I'll find more decks I want it in, but it's like, I would not like pick this super early or like spec into blue just for this. It, I guess, is how I would put it. It's like a really strong piece once you're in blue, especially like a slower or like it has to be a slower blue deck. But the reward of actually playing it out is just so good.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. It's actually in my C tier, awkwardly, because I feel like consistently when I'm building these control decks or mid-range decks or, any of these sort of like decks that would want this card in blue, I just consistently end up finding other cards that fill its niche. I think it's fine, especially because Gale Force is like a mostly good enough card on its own. It's not insane, but when it draws you a 6-drop threat, it's good. Which I think is something that it doesn't necessarily have in common with all of the other adventures. But yeah, I think this card is like, I'm never looking at this card in someone's deck and going, oh, you don't know how to draft this cube. But I just feel like consistently I find better things to be doing.
And that's entirely fair. Yeah. I think I tend to like it a lot once I've already drafted something like Break Reality or like mostly in like red blue or green blue decks where I have a decent amount of ramp that I'm not playing this out on curve after like interacting with my opponent for a few turns. I'm trying to like do a mix of interacting and then ramping into this kind of deal. But yeah.
So the next card is By the Sea, which for anyone who is familiar, this used to be in MSCM exactly as it's currently, or as it is in this cube. In the format now, this costs 2 mana, because it turns out this is a really powerful effect on 1. By the Sea is kind of awkward because I think it's a really powerful effect, but the cube doesn't back it up as well as it could. Where like it's kind of hard to hit the density of 1 mana threats plus 2 mana answers to like play a true like tempo style game plan. But with all that said, I think this card's really sweet. And it's like it's in C tier for me, but it's a high C.
Gotcha. I think pretty similar analysis. It's in low B for me, and the reason it isn't in C is because I think the 1 mana cost on it makes synergies with other cards in the cube feel more potent. Just there's lots of stuff that like wants you to be casting spells, but also like recasting this off a Spellslinger Adept or like a Will Beyond Reason or something. Is like I find myself picking this up just because it's 1 mana in a lot of decks. So
Yeah. The next card is Sensor of Possibilities. So this is super subtly one of the pieces of power reprinted in Agonos. Except unlike most other pieces of power which get strictly worsened, or not strictly worsened, but they get a nerf plus usually a color shift. This one gets a straight buff because this is Time Twister, but on a creature, or on a creature's adventure rather. And I think the card still kind of sucks in Agonos Cube. I feel like a lot of the decks that might want it don't actually want to shuffle their graveyard back into their library because it then undoes any work that they're doing to deck themselves. I think giving your opponent 7 cards is a huge risk, and I think the body just isn't super relevant most of the time. So yeah, this gets a like low C from me.
got you. This was also like C situational where I was like, I like this in Storm, but otherwise it's kind of meh. But now thinking about it, yeah, the shuffling because of how Storm decks win in this cube, uh, the shuffling your graveyard into your library is much more of a downside. Um, and like I feel like the body is fine in like if you have flicker synergies, but like you can do better.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. So Clock Tower Mastery is kind of interesting because I think it's one of the better. Okay, well, So there's 3 empty deck win conditions, and I think Clock Tower Mastery is actually the weakest of them at actually winning the game, partially because it doesn't say you win the game on it, and also one of the worst of them in decks that aren't like really dedicated towards a strategy, but at the same time, um, going just a little bit into the strategy, this card starts paying off massive dividends. So it's really hard for me to figure out like how to describe it power level wise.
Cool. So it's not just me. Because my thought was like, okay, objectively, like getting these effects for quote unquote free is like really strong. And like there's lots of ways to put cards in your graveyard, but also I never seem to find myself drafting it that often, and I feel like on curve at 3 it's a little awkward. And it's one of those cards where like I feel like I should be rating this high just based on or like not high, but like let's say like B tier or something based on its like text, but I like from the amount I like draft it slash feel charitable towards it, it feels more like a C. So I honestly just had a question mark next to this one. I was like, I'm gonna let Pip talk me into whatever rating she thinks it is.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree there. The next one is Command Whimsical Dreams, which was a fairly late addition to the cube actually. Command Whimsical Dreams is a divination with flashback, but the front side has a flash, and the backside it comes with a 4/4. It's This card's just weird. I think its strengths are a lot more limited in a Agonos cube than they would be in traditional environments, because I think in a lot of traditional environments this card is insane. And I think this is a card where I should play it more because it's possible that I'm underrating it by virtue of not playing it. Since Agonos Cube doesn't actually have that many other cheap draw spells at instant speed. Most of its draw spells are either sorcery speed or like big, but instant speed. But yeah, I think for me this is like another C tier card. It's good, but it's just not great.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I find myself like drafting it in control decks and all, but like again, like I feel like 3 mana is weirdly like an awkward spot for a lot of these cards, even though it's pretty damn good for a lot of other things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, next up is Commanding Princess. Um, this is a card which used to be one of my favorites because I used to be I used to be a very very big fan of blue black control, and I'm still a fan of that. But this cube playing the cube more has made me fall in love with other archetypes.
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, I think that this is one of those cards where it's like I would say like a low B, but only low because of like the triple blue. So you really need to be in blue for this card to play this card, or you need to have like decent fixing from whatever else you've drafted. But the reward for it is like really strong, especially if you have other flicker synergies. So I don't know. This is a card where you I wouldn't pick it up super early, but once I'm in blue, I would prioritize it. I guess how I put
Yeah, I think this is like a mid to low B tier card for me. I think it's a very powerful card, but it's a 5 mana card that like can't reasonably be your finisher, but it can be the thing that's pulling you further ahead, which is kind of great. Um, it's a great in blue card. It's very rare that I will draft a blue deck that doesn't want this. I will say that my love for this card was tied to the joke of it, and the joke of it is now decidedly less funny now that I've gotten that joke into MSEM by way of Seasons of War. So, slight strike against it.
it. This is a sort of uh, off topic, but I know that you've given people permission to reprint cards from AGC as long as they keep them the same. What do you think the possibility is that this card is reprinted in another set where it would potentially come into conflict with Seasons of War? And what do you think would happen in that case? And we don't
I
have to go
mean,
off of the weeds here. I was just curious.
the fact that the Seasons of War card is a legend and thus is, one person's name, comma, Commanding Princess means you avoid that issue for the most part.
Wait,
Um,
it's a legend?
yep, I'm pretty. Isn't she? Oh my
No,
god, no.
no,
The
she's not a
original,
legend.
the original version I pitched was a legend, and then she stopped being a legend. Well, in that case, I think that would be a war that would be resolved very poorly, is my guess. Like I think it's something where you can't really change one of their names without it being viscerally unsatisfying because it's the same joke.
Mhm.
Um, and I also have a policy towards wanting people to keep the cards as close as possible to their Agonos cubes printing. So yeah, I don't know how you resolve that, but I think it's poorly is the
Me
answer.
opening up Thesaurus and typing in princess.
I mean, yeah, that's fair, like commanding queen.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, moving on with what we're actually here to talk about, my bad, um, is Conjuration. Two and a blue, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. It gains when this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, return it to its owner's hand. I mean, again, I think this is like Aetherflash Expert but sexier for me, basically. I think that this is like because like you get to keep the creature, it works with a lot more of the cheat out targets. And usually like the when this creature becomes a target spell or ability returned to its owner's hand is like it's not trinket text because it removes some of the protection that some of your other cheat out targets might otherwise have. But like usually if they're being targeted by something, it's going to be removal that works on them. So it's like your mileage might is probably not going to vary. So yeah, I think this is like another one where I slap a situational tag on because it's very good in cheat out decks and like not like not something you play elsewhere, but it's better than Aetherflash Expert in my opinion.
yeah, this card, another shout out to Times, since this card is a reprint from Vault. This card's a pretty clear cut C for me. If you are in the cheat out deck, this is one of the best enablers for it. With the massive asterisks of some of the cheat out targets you really want to cheat out are like fuck off big enchantments or planeswalkers or artifacts, and this can't do any of those. It's only good for creatures. So that's kind of a issue with it, but it's still solid.
Entirely fair. Next up is Consult the Draco Sages, and this is actually I remember drafting a lot with the old version, um, and the new one is basically a dig through time impression where uh, it only costs blue X on the front, but you get to choose the number of cards you dig through based on how much extra you pay. Still has delve, all of that. I'm like, this is like B tier for me and solidly in the middle of it. It's like a pretty damn good draw spell, especially because we mentioned earlier when we are talking about Clock Tower Mastery that like there's a lot of just incidental milling. Um, but again, I think that like I don't think this is something that like every deck wants. So it just like naturally falls in B tier for me. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I think that's super fair. I think I have it in C tier as well. It's dig through time like, but I think this card just feels a little bit awkward where the base cost of it is blue plus exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and you can't get it better, or sorry, you can't get it cheaper than that.
Mm.
Which sounds silly. My big draw spell can't ever put me more than plus cards, and its bail case is like still a reasonable hoop, especially given that it's a singleton cube who don't have a plethora of fetch lands. Like is inarguably, it definitely you feel worse casting this than you feel casting Dig Through Time, and I think that's okay. I think that's a healthy thing. But yeah.
Okay, I think we've been sort of on a streak of like blue cards that we're like okay about, but like not really super loving. And I think the next one is one word which I'm pretty high on, which is creative construction. Essentially the cubes tinker alike, but it requires you to if you want to cheat something off of it, you have to put in more of a cost, but you can also just tutor up I almost said an artifact, and like not have to have one on the field already. I think this is like a low A for me. It's like very obviously a powerful effect, but it's not like that. It's not like an A tier card in the same way where it's like I think it's flexible enough that like even with like Break Reality, there are like several ways to build around it. Well, I think Creative Construction is just like you're basically in blue-red artifacts, and maybe not, or maybe just like colorless artifacts. But you are hard in the artifacts deck now. Usually, is how I feel about it. So it's still insanely powerful, but I think it's less flexible. Yeah.
Yeah, to me this is also a C tier card.
Damn. Okay.
Which is awkward because I recognize that Tinker's a very powerful card, but I think this cube is like slightly more hostile towards Tinker than Cannon cubes are. I think this card is very powerful, but I can't justify putting it in just like the average blue deck. And I wouldn't say it's like a reason to go blue or go to the artifact deck. So for me, that seems like very clearly C tier by the definitions I've used. But we've also established that the definitions I use are pretty harsh. So
yeah, totally fair. Mm. Yeah, I think that I was trying to give it credit because I think this is a card that I don't actually draft that much, except when I'm in Storm, in which case I'm using this to find Ethereum gears. But yeah, it's mostly just like with respect to its power, and I feel like it's a card that other people draft pretty highly too. So
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I feel like I am one of the highest people in this cube on mana rocks, and this card really requires you have a bunch of mana rocks. But I just feel like it's so easy to build decks that abuse mana rocks that just have no need for this card. Like they have enough card flow already or enough tutoring or whatever that I just don't see it as a critical piece. Um, Cyclone Archmage. So this is another C tier card for me. I think it's fine in the decks where it's good in, like, oh wow, in a like Storm Ritual, in a deck where you're like, playing Ryukami's Wake and all these other mana doublers, this card's great. It's just like kind of underwhelming in most other contexts. So
yeah, it's a card when I was first into Peace in Our Time, I used to draft this a lot because I'm like, oh my god, you can just go off with Peace in Our Time, and it's like, I guess, but like, how often? Well, like, what is like the average case for this? And the average case is pretty meh. This was also in my C tier. I think it's pretty low C actually.
yeah, very much a if this is your best thing to be doing with Peace in Our Time, that's actually probably a sign that Peace in Our Time has failed. Or sorry,
Yeah.
Peace in Our Time deck has not worked out. So The next card is Daydreaming. This card is in a very similar spot as Cyclone Archmage, where it is really good in the decks that are comboing off with it, and I think it's actually pretty damn good in other decks too, but it's just not, like, as noticeably cracked. You like this is also pretty good in the control decks, but the control decks don't usually need this. Like, you're not spending a pick on this, you're spending a pick on other cards. Like, if the pack gets down to it and there's nothing else, I'm happy to have this, but I'm not usually excited about it.
Yeah, this is also my C tier for a similar reason. It's like good in like in like Storm, big mana, or like really like slow control decks, but it's not like generically useful, and there are definitely better options. So, and I feel like we're rating a lot of cards as C, but I feel like that's because in blue there's sort of a dichotomy of like there's a lot of A tiers because there's a lot of like flexible cards that can go into a bunch of decks, like cantrips. But there's also a lot of cards where it's like this is like solidly good once you're in the archetype. And so it's like the color's like pulling in two directions in that sense. Which, like, I think is also like a natural division in like lots of cube cards, but I think it's most exemplified in blue.
Yeah. So Eleanor, Our Lady of Mist, is.
Oh no, you missed a card. You missed a card.
I skipped over a card, a very important card. The next card is Destabilize. So this is, I think, the second best counterspell in the cube. With the first one taking the prize for notable reasons. But yeah, Destabilize is literally the top of B tier for me. Every blue deck wants it. I don't think it's a reason to go into blue, but if you saw it like mid-ish into the pack and you were like, oh, okay, this made it most of the way around the table, no one else is in blue, yeah, let's go into it. That makes sense to me. But yeah, this card's very powerful.
Word. I had it as A minus because I spent like 10 minutes trying to like jockeying reasons between high B and low A, and I just kind of said fuck it and left it there. It's just good, is the bottom line. Like, the only reason it's not solidly A tier is because not every deck is gonna want counter spells, but like, it's just really solid as interaction is all.
Yeah, I agree with that. Eleanor, unfortunately, we're going to drop back to C briefly. She's great in the Flicker deck. I've tried to make her work in other archetypes, and man, she does not hold up there. Which is unfortunate. I think especially unfortunate because, like, the -2 and -7 look like you could play them in non-Flicker decks, but, like, in practice, no, you can't. Because you can't get to the -7 unless you're plussing a lot of times. And if you don't have good targets with the plus, that's, like, it's really forgettable.
Yeah, I put this in B, but we've been known that I'm like Flicker deck stan, so like objectively this is like basically an attackable Conjurer's Closet, which is not a good place to be. So I'd agree with the C assessment. Next up is Elton Force Mage, which, hey, talking about the Flicker deck, I think this is pretty good as just sort of mana war. Yeah, it's just a mana war. I think this is like high C for me, high C, low B, where it's like you can play this in like control or whatever, but it's sort of underwhelming as just like a mana war. And obviously there's the recite, but I feel like the recite is something that like is actively okay. But yeah, this is one of those things where like it really spikes as a Flicker target, and I think is just fine otherwise. And I had it in C, but I could see the argument of like flipping it with Eleanor and putting it in B.
So for me, this is actually mid B. I'm happy to play this in literally any control deck without a single Flicker card. This will sometimes be the one creature in my deck when I'm playing like blue combo decks. Because I think something that either you're undervaluing or maybe I'm overvaluing, and the only way to become sure is via testing, is I think the ability to play this, bounce a creature, trade it off, then bounce another creature, is like just so good at stalling out games and just making your opponent have to take the game at your speed. Um, so yeah, the one thing of note is this card is a mana war and doesn't have the protection of something like more modern mana war. So if you play it on an empty board, it does have to bounce itself. But don't worry about it. Just don't play it in those contexts.
Yeah, I guess where I'm landing is I feel like in the times where you're slowing the game down, you're also not super gaining anything off of it in the sense of like you're spending all of your mana each of those turns presumably to Elton Force Mage, and I think that you want to be incrementally advancing your position unless you really have like some crazy top end haymakers that your opponent can't just like removal spell or like be like, okay, cool, I'll replay my creatures and still keep killing you. Because I feel like, I guess my feeling is like, the aggro decks don't quite go under this, but they go under it enough, and like everything else is probably going to be playing at a speed where this is fine anyway. Where like just mana war is fine anyways. But I could definitely, again, I totally agree with we need to play test this assessment because this is all like mental magic right now. So yeah.
Yeah, the other thing, insofar as that goes, is it's like there's plenty of decks I will draft in this cube where I'm fine for the only advancement of my board state is I draw another card and I hit another land drop. And that might be like the big difference.
Mm-hmm.
So this next card is actually really fucked up. And it doesn't look that way initially. Endless Possibilities is blue. Oh well, I don't need to read out the exact thing, but it's effectively a Glimmer of Genius for 5 mana instead of 4, but you free cast something 4 mana or less. It is so easy to hit this like a worthwhile card. In the top 4 cards of your library, plus the cards that were already in your hand. And the fact it is rebaiting the mana makes this effect just so much more powerful. Because, you know, again, the issue with draw spells is they don't impact the board. So the second you have a draw spell that impacts the board, they kind of just break. I know this card is good because it's actually a reprint from Myriad.
Oh, okay. Which, hey, quick shout out. Not sure exactly when this is going up, but I believe that Highlander Core 2 will still be in development and Myriad is starting up again. So go check the description for details on that.
Hell yeah. So I've cast this card actually a fair bit, and it always feels really sweet to cast. I think this card is actually probably underrated in Agonos based on how often I feel like I end up with my hands on it. This card like mid A tier for me. Actually, no, it's towards the bottom end of A tier. I forgot how stacked A tier was. But it's just so easy to ambush people in combat with this card in like a mid-rangey deck, and it's so easy to just go over the top of people in control or combo decks. Like, just imagine casting a board wipe off this spell in response to your opponent swinging. Broken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a card which I thought I was high on it, and because I think this is like the more reasonable of the 5 mana cards, which I used to love a lot because I played a lot of UB control. Endless Possibilities used to be my baby. I had it in like high B, where I was like, this card is really good and fucked up, but like at 5 mana, it's just sort of on the edge of like not quite sure if this is gonna land in every deck, but like I don't know. I think I'm like a big fan of this card personally, and I was trying to temper my expectations. So to hear you put it in A is like, okay, cool, vindicated a little bit.
The next card is also the literal bottom of my A tier, but it's still an A tier. Far Realm Explorer is really broken because it's an Elvish Visionary in blue, but also it sometimes randomly wins you the game. Or like more relevantly, it's an Elvish Visionary that you can jump off and then spend another 2 mana to draw a card later if you need to. So kind of investigate it.
Yeah, who would ever print a 2 mana card that draws you a card that could win the game?
Who would ever print a 2 mana creature that, as part of their ETB, it just like was like, oh, you have an empty library, guess you win the game? That'd be insane.
That'd be insane.
Worth noting, because some people make this mistake a lot, if your library has 1 or 0 cards when this trigger resolves, you win the game. You don't lose the game from drawing on an empty library if the ability is also winning you the game. This card is actually really easy to win with. I think it is the best of all of the empty library win cons. And a lot of that power level is just in how good it is in every sort of fair deck. You don't run it in like the blue prowess decks, but whether you're a blue flicker deck or a blue control deck or any of the blue combo decks, this card's fantastic.
Yeah, so I had this in like mid B, where I was like, this card is one of those cards where literally every deck wants it, but like it's not like super crazy. It was my feeling, where it's like the flicker decks love it. As like a control deck you like this, as a mid-range deck you like this. It's great for the combo decks, but like I never feel like I gotta get my hands on this. It's just sort of like, huh, neat, I'll take this. But maybe I should be valuing it higher, because ultimately my evaluation makes it sound like this is pretty high. So
Yeah. I think that's fair. I just think that if you have this in your if you can pick this, it's usually an incentive to play blue. And it's very rare I cut this from a deck, but I agree that it's certainly not a reason to hard pivot. But it's like one of the more powerful things about blue, in my opinion. Unlike this next card.
yeah, and I was about to say. So Faded Seer, I feel like this card is super sad. I think that there's a world where it could be a reasonable. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't played enough with Days to know. I feel like maybe there's a world where this could be a reasonable card, but like there's just no tempo. Like there's no tempo deck really at the current stage of the cube, so it just feels super awkward to pick. This is I think this might be my only D tier card in blue, and again, I don't think that's very much the Faded Seer's fault itself. It's partially Faded Seer's fault. I'm trying to give it too much credit.
It's your fault.
Yeah.
This card is just so awkward because like I can picture what I was thinking, but this is just so much worse than Days. And it's just like when you compare it to something like Curse Catcher, it's better than Curse Catcher. When you compare it to the owl that's like Curse Catcher but has flying, it's like it's probably better than that, but not by a lot. And it's like that starts to get a little bit sus. And the gameplay of it's not particularly good. There's no decks that want it. This card is like the lowest blue card I have. It's in either D or F. If this card's in your deck, I think usually your deck is either misbuilt or you drafted really poorly. Find Answers, however. Love this card. This is a card I've cast a lot, but just not in Agonos Cube. And it's mid to high B tier for me. Basically never cut it in blue. I'm always excited to pick it up if I am in blue, but it's not like a reason that you go, alright, time to play blue.
Gotcha. This is basically an A tier for the reasons I talked about with cantrips earlier.
Yeah, I think this card is pretty interchangeable with Astrolabic Wisdom, so I think that's fair.
So the next one is a card that I referenced earlier. It's actually a card that like I've become a little bit higher on recently, just because I've been drafting a lot more Poliano Spellweaver. It's Forget-Me-Lots, which I mentioned when you're talking about Arc-Villain's Ploy, that there are 2 counterspells which you can quote-unquote hard lock with. And this is one of them with Poliano Spellweaver. Because you return Poliano Spellweaver to your hand, you replay it next turn. Since Forget-Me-Lots is free, it's not going to cost you like 6 mana or whatever. And you just keep doing that until they double spell or whatever. But usually by that time you have assembled other interaction, etc. Or they're playing a deck which is low to the ground enough that you would have needed other answers anyways. Yeah, this is like a high B for me just because it's like free interaction anyways, and again, I like cards where like you can pick them up and then they spike with some of your other picks. And I just like from a design perspective, I like the returning a blue permanent to your hand because I feel like it encourages to make this free. You aren't there's additional incentives to play to the board, which I think is cool. And so it makes it like a little bit better in like blue mid-rangey decks where you're like, I play Farm Explorer on 2, and then I play something else on 3, and then I just bounce this or whatever. But yeah, give me like a Terraformer's Globe with this, please.
Yeah, I think that's actually something the cube would benefit from, is having enchantments or artifacts that are worth bouncing with this. I think this card is like mid-C, unfortunately. I think that there are so many decks where you have to like actually cast this for mana, and it's like it's a fine card, but I think where this card goes from being like fine to being like, yes, this is powerful and what I want to be doing in a high powered cube is when there are worthwhile creatures to bounce with it. And I think the blue limiting factor is a little bit rough on this. Obviously, if you're doing a coordinated commotion type lock, this has a lot of value, but I don't think the average use case of it is particularly high.
Entirely fair. As we've established, this is there's parts of my evaluation that are just like preferences of stuff I like to draft.
Mm-hmm. So Fulbert Rogue Spymaster, another card that's actually a reference to Myriad. This card's at the very top of C for me because I think that the adventure is pretty good but not insane, and the creature is pretty good but not insane. I never want Fulbert to be my entire game plan as a tempo or control deck, but I think he's a good part of that plan.
Yeah, this was actually like mid-low B tier for me, and I think because of what you mentioned, I feel like we talked about there being no like tempo deck earlier, and I think that's still true. But there is this sort of like slightly lower on the curve control deck where you play this and another card we're going to see later, which also is 1 blue and has a 3/1 stat line, and you have like this density of like cheap creatures that run away with the game as long as you can keep answering any threats to them. That's like cool. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Basically, I feel like there's a deck there, and that's what makes me put him in B instead of C.
I think he just needs a little bit more, is my feeling in terms of like could be a deck.
That's
But
fair.
we'll see, I suppose. Galaxy's Will, really easy C tier for me, honestly. Like, I'm never upset to put this card in my deck. I mean, I guess maybe it should be higher because it's a card where I'm basically never cutting this from a blue deck ever, and has like 3 solid modes for 2 mana. Like, it never is really bad, but it's never the star of the show. It's never something I'm excited to pick, and it's never something that like makes a deck work. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think for the reasons that you said, maybe it should be higher. That's why I just put it in B tier. It's basically all there is to it. I never look at this card and go like, you're gone. See ya.
Yeah.
Next up, I'm going to go first because I'm going to pose this as a question. I actually do not get what this card is supposed to be doing, and I feel like maybe I should have brought that up earlier. Where I'm like, this is a card which, whenever I see it, I just have not been able to picture myself like knowing what kind of deck that this goes into. That makes me put it in a D, but it's entirely possible I'm missing something.
Nope, it's also a D tier for me. I think this card is trying to fit into a deck that doesn't really exist. Part of the original design seed / idea behind this card is, it's a kind of constant source of resetting the game that you can dictate, i.e. it happens on your upkeep, it's a you may. You can control this, and it allows you to either A, be a combo deck that just tries to grind people out via going off every single time, and just seeing, like, did they leave up mana this time? Did they draw into their 1 removal spell? Whatever. Or on the other end of the spectrum, part of the design seed is, did you know Felden's Cane used to be restricted in Vintage because of how powerful the ability to shuffle your graveyard back into your library was? Because if you're a control deck and all your removal is like Swords to Plowshares or whatever, you can just remove all of your opponent's threats from the game and then recycle your deck until you kill them. And Galvanized Genius was kind of trying to do that, where if you combine this with exile removal or incremental forms of advantage, you can make it so that they're drawing into a worse 5 cards than you are. But no, in practice, this is a clear-cut D card. I don't think there's a deck that really wants it, and I think it's pretty bad, even in the decks that do want it.
Nice. Okay. Next up is Hexwing Meditent. It's really funny because this is not the 1 blue 3/1 stat line card that I was talking about earlier, but I'm realizing that this is also a 1 blue 3/1 stat line. So sure, this goes in a Very similar sort of deck, I'd say. Um, Again, I think that this is like a solid middle of B tier for me because again, I feel like it goes in like it can go in your like interactive control decks. It can go in like and it goes in Flicker because you can just flicker it and keep drawing cards, etc. This is and again, since I like Flicker, this is a card which shows up in my decks fairly often. But I think yeah, it's just a solid B tier for me.
Yeah, this is fairly high in B tier for me. It's very rare that I'm playing a blue deck that doesn't want it. Like, I guess some of the really dedicated artifact combo decks. And it's a card that allows you to play a bunch of different roles in a given game.
Ooh. Next up is Imagine. This is another one of the cantrip suite in the cube. I think it is one of the worst ones, and so it is high B instead of A for me. But again, still, I like my cantrips, so
Yeah, this for me is a C tier card because you don't want to run this in the average blue deck necessarily. I guess you can, technically speaking, Opt is fine. Although it's worth noting that this is marginally worse than Opt because A, it's a sorcery, and B, it requires you shuffle back. So that means if you've done other like cantripping or sculpting, or sorry, it requires you shuffle. So if you've put cards on the bottom of your deck you don't want to see, you have a forced shuffle before you do the scry one. Um, it can be really powerful in the mid to late game, which is a nice time for a cantrip to be powerful. I've played with this effect a bunch in Myriad, where I've like, oh, well, you go into mid to late game and then you suddenly put all the best cards from your graveyard into your library. It's kind of awkward in this because so many of the blue decks have an empty library kind of backup plan, which this doesn't play nice with. So, yeah, this is mid C for me.
fair. Again, and I think we talked about earlier how I value cheap. Like when we talked about Buy the Sea, I was like, sometimes I just put this in my deck because it's cheap, and I think that Imagine falls into that place. Plus, it's a cantrip for me, but also the points about it. Uh, I think I rarely think about the how bad shuffling your grave or shuffling your deck slash having to shuffle your graveyard in is. So those are valid points.
Um, Next one's Jake Gordon back in style. Fun fact: the original name of this card referenced his origins in Degeneracy Inc., but I couldn't figure out a way that sounded well. Um, Jake Gordon's kind of awkward. He's a C tier planeswalker for me. I think all of the blue planeswalkers are in C tier, where I think the average blue deck, none of the planeswalkers are like really good in the average blue deck, but all of them have their own little niches. If you have a lot of artifacts, Jake Gordon's quite good because the +1 counts both lands and every mana rock and himself. So when the +1's drawing 2 cards, the card is really good. The -1's mediocre, and the ult is also pretty mediocre. But yeah, I think he's defensible. I don't think he's ever like awful, but I think there's plenty of decks where he's not good.
Yeah, I know he's not like new to the cube, but like he was in like the latest big revision, so I haven't had as many drafts with him. Um, I'm generally feeling I put him in a C tier, but I was kind of feeling not sure about it because again, I'm just like I look at him and I'm like, I guess he's pretty good with mana rocks, and maybe I'm not evaluating the -1 super great, but I've never felt like, oh yeah, Jake Gordon, gotta pick this guy up.
Yeah.
And I guess continuing the train of blue planeswalkers, next up we have Kel Tempest's Will. Um, this is another one which is like interesting for me because I feel like I mostly pick her up in like Stormish decks, but then I never feel quite good about doing so because she's like 4 mana or whatever. But and I feel like the fact that I feel like her +1 is good, but the fact that it doesn't generate card advantage like Jake Gordon, I've never felt super great about. This is another C for me, and it's pretty low in C, but I feel like I could be missing something because again, it's new and I'm notoriously bad at validating planeswalkers. So
Yeah, that's kind of fair. I think Kel's actually quite good. I've been drafting her a lot recently in the like usually blue, green, X 4-color decks. Whether that's blacklist or redlist for the most part. Because the +1's mana fixing if you are like base blue already. And I think that Kel just gives you a lot of nice little incremental advantage. I think the biggest strike against Kel is the fact that she's 4 mana, and a lot of the actual really good planeswalkers are also 4 mana. So she's C tier, one of the lower planeswalkers, but I think she's actually better than she looks.
Okay, entirely fair.
Ley Tracer is also a low C card. It's one of those things where I think Merfolk Looters always are stronger than they look. I'm sure Ley Tracer is no exception, but I just so rarely feel the need to run Merfolk Looters in my control decks, and I just haven't really drafted Reanimator in any reasonable amount of time in this cube. So,
This is a C, but like a high C for me. Interestingly, I like drafting Reanimator, but this is like one of my first cuts in Reanimator, just because I don't like my way of getting my creatures into my graveyard being on something that can be removed, and there's so many other ways to do it. And I don't like that her second ability isn't Trinket Text, but I feel like it is, in the sense of if I'm putting more mana into this, I'm like, is there not something else I could be doing? And if there isn't, I'm like, so I still do like her in graveyard based mid range decks. But again, yeah, it's easy first cut for me a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's super fair. So, Masterful Manipulation is the final card I have in the D tier. This card is just so bad. This card, the thing it's trying to pitch is, if you are a blue devotion deck, you get a 2 mana steal a creature permanently, which is pretty powerful, but the blue devotion decks don't really work or exist in the way that this card suggests they do. And the fail case of this is just fucking awful. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is another card where Galvanized Genius, for the longest time I'm like, am I fucking missing something? Because I'm reading this card and it doesn't compute for me. But yeah, this is a D tier for me too. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's something that's fun about Agonos Cube where I clearly designed it piece by piece, and I didn't have it fully, and we really vied what works and what doesn't. And there's some cards that kind of promise or indicate archetypes that I just did not quite support enough. And this is one of them, and those cards will get replaced eventually.
Yeah, and it's again, totally fair. Because it's such a huge ass project. Mm-hmm.
Memories Ruse is sweet. It's in C tier for me, but it's higher than a bunch of the counter spells in C tier. I think it has 2 really flexible rules. It plays quite well, but it's just a little bit more conditional than a lot of the other 2 mana counter spells that I think are actively good. So I think this is just fine. It's rarely something that I'm sad about. I play most decks, but it's not something I'm usually excited.
Okay, I'm kind of shocked. The C tier, and I think this is just because I draft this card a lot, even with the double blue. I put it in mid B, where it's I find myself drafting this card a lot, just because the return target instant or sorcery card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand mode. I like picking this. If I'm in blue, I like picking this up early, just because if I open a piece of power in the next 2 packs, this is another way to recur it, in addition to whatever else I might pick up. And I just like it for counterspell density. Once I'm in a deck that an interactive blue deck, I'm like, sure, I'll throw this in for counterspell density. So this is a mid high B for me. Oh, I also I'm this is another card where I'm fine with this in Storm, because then I just recur whatever my best instant or sorcery is, or recur a lava contract or whatever, and it's off to the races. Cool.
Yeah, totally. Nexus Gate is, I think, the second best of the empty deck win conditions, because its base case is pretty solid, and it's just the type is good. It's just really nice to have around. I love playing this in control decks where it's just a little card filtration engine that also sometimes wins you the game. But yeah, that's kind of all there is.
Yep, I had this in high B. just for those reasons. It's like it's a really flexible card that is kind of just good everywhere, but like I don't know that I would go into uh, blue for this.
Totally.
Which is going to be kind of hypocritical when I talk about the next card, which is just going to show off the fact that I like playing control decks a little too much. But one of the crowd is an A tier for me. I think that the Convoke can happen, but we don't have enough of like a tempo deck where you're throwing down cheap creatures for this to be Convoke most often. I think it's just Counterspell. Um, and I'm fine with that. I like my Counterspell. Like, it's just a solid, powerful card.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree. I think that the convoke happens like you can still convoke it with similar things as you would be self-bouncing with Forget Me Lots. So like, you tap your Poliano Spellweaver that you played earlier, or your Far Realm Explorer or something. But I think the card is just decidedly okay. I think you just play this as counterspell and you're happy about it. I have it in B tier as a result.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the quote-unquote right rating.
Um, Oracle of Winter is not that good. It is basically at the bottom of my C tier. It is a weird combination where it looks good, it is good stats, it has evasion, and it has this like kind of engine-y thing. But just in practice, it's just not where the blue decks really want to be as they are currently constructed. Or at least the ones that I consistently end up drafting. Where once you get to 4 and 5 mana, you just want to be tapping out for these like massive win the game planeswalkers. It's possible that if I drafted things more, or if the blue-green flash tempo deck became a thing, that this card's stock would go up substantially.
Interesting. I think that this is again a card that I don't draft as much because I don't draft as much now because I don't draft as much control. But like back when I did this with Commanding Princess was one of like the fail case cheats with the card we're going to talk about later. Um, and I just like this as like a sort of like reasonable control win con. I had this in like mid low B, but I feel pretty fine like when I'm drafting a control deck being like, oh yeah, this is one of my win cons.
Yeah.
And maybe that'll change in practice when I play with it. But I see flash, I see evasion, I pick.
Yeah, the main issue I have with it as flash evasion is the fact that it is still vulnerable to removal spells. And I think it encourages you to like cast things slightly awkwardly, but I don't know. It's possible I am overhating it. Order of the Seas is so unfortunately close to being good. I mentioned this with the last episode, but I think the Order the cycle just doesn't quite work right now. Order of the Seas is like I think the closest one to being powerful because the base case of if you were in mono blue, this is 3 mana dismiss is really good, but it just is kind of rough from that point onwards. So yeah, like mid to low C, I think I have it in.
Yep, I put in C tier for the same reason. If you're not in like mono blue or heavy mono blue, then it like again and forget the 5 or more or 7 or more. You really want to hit that 3 or more to be playing this, and to do that on curve you have to be mostly mono blue. So yeah.
Um, the next card is one I deeply love. Arobi, who outsmarts time, is a really, really powerful card if you have any way of cheating it out fast. With, of course, the most powerful of those being Remake in My Image. I think we'll get to Remake soon, but I think Arobi is single-handedly why Remake in My Image is so high for me in this cube. This card is just an utter beast. Unfortunately, if you can't put it into most blue decks, but the blue decks you can put it into, it is just a star. So I have it in C tier. But like if you said, oh, it's a situational B tier card, I think that's super defensible.
Yeah, I just slapped a situational tag on this, and I'm like, the card I was talking about earlier when I was talking about cheating out Oracle of Winter, it was Remake in My Image, where it's like, I think that sometimes you want to pick up these cards where they're like reasonable with Remake, And then sometimes you just draw the nut draw, and you have Orobi plus Remake, and it's great. But if you don't, you have like these control win cons that are otherwise reasonable to draw, and hitting them on turn 2 while countering their threat just ends games. So yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Orobi Remake was, I think, I have to go back, but I think it might have been the first thing that made me fall in love with the cube. Where it's like, this is fucking stupid. Sign me up for more.
Yeah, I think so. Remake in My Image is a card from Myriad, um, and
Okay,
Arobi
okay,
is
we're talking about it a lot now. Do you want to just skip forward and talk about Remake?
sure. Let's break order for a little bit. Remake in My Image is actually even pointed in Myriad, because it is a mana drain like, and by that I mean it counters a spell and then you can free cast the next spell you play this turn. So there is a hoop here, which is unlike mana drain, where you can counter your opponent's spell, then untap into your like Worm Coil Engine or whatever the fuck, and it's like, oh, well, the game is over. Remake in My Image requires you either A, have a playable instant or flash thing, or your opponent does something silly on your turn, you counter it, and then slam something. Um, so if you notice, there's actually quite a few good flash cards, or instants that we've talked about that I think are better because of Remake in My Image. Like, Endless Possibilities is such a powerful payoff for Remake in My Image.
Mm.
Um, Hexwing Meditent is entirely fine as a payoff. Like, Princess is a nuts payoff. There's so many good things to be doing with this card. And again, the fail case is it's counterspell. I think it's actually a card where it can often bait people into playing it incorrectly because they're like holding on to it to try to get max value, whereas you actually should just sometimes cast it. But yeah,
Yeah, this is my only blue S tier, I think. And you mentioned that you don't have any S tier, so I would totally understand this
it's the
being
top
an
of
A tier. Yeah.
yeah, it's the literal top of A tier for me.
Hmm.
Um, the next card on our list is towards the bottom of A tier for me, which is Otter Slide. Um, Otter Slide being open is a reason to play blue, in my opinion. I have played blue decks that don't want Otter Slide, but I think that that's more of a consequence of those decks like leaning on something else that's powerful and broken, something like a Peace in Our Time style engine, where it's like, oh well, I have a bunch of creatures, so I can't reliably proc Otter Slide. But in the decks that can proc Otter Slide, it doesn't take that many otters before you just take over games. Um, and the card feeds in itself in a really broken way.
Yeah, this is literal top of B tier for me, where it's like, or maybe not literal top, but like it's really, really close. It's one of the most fun and cool build rounds in the cube. It's also one of the reasons, like I mentioned, that like I'm higher on 1 mana spells, because then you can just chain a bunch of them with Otter Slide. Um, but yeah, I think like it's interesting because I've always felt that like this card is super cool, but like it's easy to get baited into it. So it's interesting to hear your perspective that like almost any blue deck would want to run this. Because my feeling has been like the more I draft with it, the more I'm like, you really want to be maximizing how much value you're getting off on tapping with it. So
Absolutely. Um, the next one is something that I currently have in like mid B, but I think honestly it should probably be higher, which is Poliano Spellweaver. But you've talked about Poliano Spellweaver a lot, so you should just take it off from here.
yeah, so this is a card which is like mid A for me, and I think that it's a card that's like recently, or not recently, but like semi recently come into that. I just think it's so flexible. Like the sorcery of Contemplate is like pretty reasonable for like a lot of decks. It's especially fine in stuff like Reanimator, where it's like, okay, cool. I just play this and I bin whatever. It really spikes with like, again, like we mentioned, there are some ways to like lock with it. You can in the Flicker decks, it's obviously insane. With you can, it's one of the cards along with like Lysilana Patrol, where you can like you can like just keep looping 1 mana spells or not, or just like spells in general with Peace in Our Time. And obviously these are like lots of these are like, I'm talking about like high points, but I think that what makes Polyana Spellweaver really good is that its base case is so damn solid, and then there are a lot of different ways to like synergize and spike off with the card. So this is a card which I have just been finding myself picking up higher and higher the more I play the cube. So yeah, mid
Yeah,
A.
it's a card that is pretty drastically overtuned in a lot of different ways. But I think it's sweet, and the sort of decks it kind of unlocks um, is a reason to pick it up pretty highly. I also haven't seen anyone really taking advantage of it in Reanimator style decks, but it's also very good there.
Next up is Paramenesia, and I think that this is a card where I think I spied your tier list earlier, and I think I'm actually lower on it than you. So I'm going to talk about my thoughts on it, and then I think that you're going to have some points which I haven't thought of. So my thing is, I rarely feel that I am going to draft this outside of like Storm or some other like low to the ground in the sense of like I have a bunch of cantrips or whatever style deck where the fact that you like have to play them this turn makes it like not quite like I think that you can easily draw two cards off of this, and I think Scry 2 draw 2 is at sorcery speed is like kind of insane. But I feel like if I'm playing this, I really want to be like doing something more with it, which sounds crazy, but like I don't know, just like the sorcery speed of it, the potential to like whiff on something and like not really hit cards you can play off of it. I don't know. I feel like I back when I was like, I guess I there was a time where like, and I think I'm still in this time where like I'm like I don't quite get how the storm decks like win, and so I like tried to goldfish some of them. And when I played this in Storm, like the goldfish felt great, and then I'm like, how often is this going to happen in other decks though? So that's just my feeling on it. It's a C tier for me, where I'm like, if you're in Storm, great. Otherwise, I think that it's fine.
Yeah, that's fair. So the thing about Paramnesia is it is a 2 mana cantrip that you never want to cast on 2 and you very rarely want to cast on 3. And I think that's kind of a hard sell for a lot of people. But the thing is, it's really not hard for this to be the draw 1 is easy mode, right? Like it's you scry 2, you cast when you don't have a land drop, you scry 2, you find a land, you play that land. That's pretty close to the floor. 2 mana Preordain is a bad floor. I would not defend this in this cube. But I think, it's similar to Galaxy's Will in that that is a floor to acknowledge. When this card goes off, when you either have like Ethereum gears or just a lot of mana at your disposal or other ways of filtering your library, this card generates more card advantage than any other card reasonably could for 2 mana. This is equivalent to a draw X spell in the late game that allows you to be taking other game actions other than drawing cards. A lot of the decks that are trying to win the game with an empty library, this is one of the better ways to achieve that, assuming their deck is built in a way that lets you like really take advantage of this. And I think one area where this card is kind of underexplored is in the blue-green, whatever storm decks. Those decks rarely end up with the extra land drop effects. This card scales insanely well with extra land drops. For me, this is like one of the reasons to play blue because this is such a powerful combo card. And I wouldn't play it outside of those combo decks, but it's one of those things where if you have your mana under you and you untap and this is the card you draw, you can go from having very few resources to winning the game that turn. And that makes me very high on it as a result.
Entirely fair. Which I'm assuming from the way you said it, it's a A tier for you.
Yeah, it's a mid A tier for me.
Gotcha. And again, I think that this is another card where if like when I play, if and when I played in actual games, I could either be validated or be shown that I'm like completely wrong about it. And
Same
though
thing.
also I guess like part of it is like I did acknowledge like I love this when I'm going off. I love this card when I'm going off that, and I might just be undervaluing how much I should be like specking into that early.
Yeah.
Next up is the card that I was actually talking about when I was talking about Fulbert, which is our other 1UU 3/1. It's Phantasmal Stalker. I think this isn't like low B, high C for me, where it's like if this survives for one turn, you give it hexproof, and then it slowly becomes this like true name nemesis alike that also draws you cards. The problem is just getting it to stick. But I think that in density with other like with the other like 3 mana 3/1s, it gives you like a way to like close out games and control that's really like low to the ground / aggressive.
So this card was really an attempt at creating fixed true name nemesis. I played it a bit in Myriad. I think I succeeded, but also when you fix true name nemesis, it gets kind of bad. I think this is a C tier card pretty clearly for me. It is nice to ramp, like as it ramps up, it becomes a pretty terrifying threat. But your opponent does have a full turn cycle to potentially kill it before you give it hexproof. And I think that the tempo sorts of decks that this is really good in don't quite exist yet. And the mid-range decks that could abuse True Name Nemesis can't really abuse this.
Entirely fair. Next up is, I think, one of my favorite cards in the cube. It's Plot. I think that I don't even know that there's much I have to say about this. I think this is just like a high A card because the floor of it as like a brainstorm, but you don't actually have to shuffle away the cards is pretty clearly insane. And then if you spec into blue heavily, it's like, oh wait, I don't actually lose those cards. I can get them back later. Okay, sign me up.
Yeah, this card's awesome. It was in DGI actually, but it didn't have the activated cost. It was just exile it from your graveyard to do that. That's obviously messed up. But I like this card because I like how Brainstorm plays, and I think this does a good job of making Brainstorm playable in a cube environment where you don't reliably have fetch lands. This is like basically at the top of A for me.
I would agree.
The next card is Quell the Storm. Not a ton to say about this. This is mid C for me. It's a counterspell that sometimes is very good in Devotion to Blue sorts of decks, or even just decks that are blue and play to the board. But it's also just like, it's a fine spell if you have no Devotion to Blue. So, yeah.
Huh, interesting. I was putting it in mid B and I thought I was maybe underrating it. And I guess we talked about how I'm independent of the Devotion to Blue because I feel like that's not something you should rely on coming up, but I just like this for counterspell density and for being one of the counterspells which is just reasonably flexible. So yeah.
Yeah,
I have this in mid B and I draft it fairly often, so that's all there is to it.
that's fair. Reclaimed by Dreams is in my mid B tier. I think this is a really powerful counterspell. It's effectively a mana leak or a 1 mana leak that is a remand instead. I think this is just a really good card at being both a reasonably playable card and also a smash glass in case of emergency sort of card. Where, like, you know, your opponent, usually you want to cast this as a 2 mana spell, but let's say you're on the draw and your opponent casts like a must answer 2-drop. You can say, okay, I don't have an answer, I'm just going to remand that for a turn and hope I'll have another answer the following turn.
I think we're seeing from this in Quell the Storm that like I'm kicking up these counterspells a tier, but Reclaimed by Dreams is like middle of A for me. I think I
That's
specifically like it because it's like, in addition to like those applications you mentioned, it's along with Destabilize. I feel like it's one of the counterspells where like I'm pretty comfortable just running this in combo as just like,
yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
okay, like you're not gonna get it next turn, so fuck you. You can put it back into your hand, whatever.
Sure, here's my 1 mana leak. This is fine.
Mhm.
Um, Refracting Pattern is a pretty damn good card. Um, I think the thing that's awkward about this is the deck that wants Hypnotize is not the same as the deck that wants the Mirror Image mode. I really like this design, like, aesthetically. It, like, you know, makes my brain itch in a good way, but I think power level wise, or like kind of the decks that it goes in this cube, it actually doesn't rate that highly. It's a mid-C for me, but I think there's some decks which make this look quite good.
I don't know that I have anything to add. It's mid C for me as well. Oh, actually, I guess I have one thing to add, which is that uh, despite looking like it, this art is not a Wombo art.
Apparently this art's a canon art on some random token.
Oh, that is actually quite surprising. It doesn't feel like an art that would be a canon art.
I agree, which is why it's in this cube. I was just informed of that recently.
Hmm.
Um, so Riga, a Praean health dealer, um, is definitely getting a name change at some point. This card is basically just here as it is a way of me putting a Blackboard Richard Garfield PhD in this cube. I think the card is decidedly okay. It's pretty low C tier for me, but it's really fun when you get to do the thing. I love playing with Richard Garfield PhD as an effect. Um, and I think there's plenty of times where if we were draft paper, um, likely to draft this card just as kind of like an excuse to play with it, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that like every cube needs a few of those where it's just like because I feel like there's times where like even though the point of cube is to have such high power, sometimes you just get bored with the decks you usually draft, or like get bored of like spiking it, and you're like, let's do something funky. And having something that supports that, but is still a reasonably fine card, I think is cool. I actually have this guy in low B tier. Um, I feel like of the blue planeswalkers, I'm actually more fine drafting this than some of the other 4 mana options, just because I like the consistent digging slash card advantage of the plus. I feel like the -3 can come down and like help you stabilize on a board uh, reasonably well, and obviously the alt is pretty crazy. So there's other options I would prefer for a control deck, but I think that this is fine for blue control slash mid range decks.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. All right, so the next tier is one of my higher end A tier cards. I actually had it above Break Reality, and it's Rob
Whoa.
Blind. Rob Blind is a super fucked up card. Fun fact: this was originally going to be printed in a set that is now in MSEM. But the person who made the set realized it's way too fucked up to have an MSE or to have an MSEM bound set. Um, but Rob Blind is very good if you're casting it for X equals anything greater than 1 at removing your opponent's biggest threats while also drawing you them. Um, I think it's a card that is really easy to underestimate because, you know, generally things that steal from people's decks aren't that powerful because it doesn't address the board. But if you are a control deck and you get to the mid game and like you've stabilized, your opponent hasn't put you in a difficult situation, whatever, if you just dump all your mana into this card can just risk ripping all of your opponent's things that actually can beat you out of their deck and just basically ensuring you win the long game.
All of that is fair, and I think again this is a card which might change if I play with it. But yeah, I had this in like high C tier. I'm like, I really like this in Storm or like any big mana deck as a way to just yoink them. Um, it's obviously good in control, but like the triple blue is so harsh for me, and I feel like there are often times where I'm like, I feel like I want to just be playing something else. I feel like this gets the cut a lot when I'm building, and that could be wrong. But yeah, this is just high C for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I had a lot of those opinions, it only had 2 blue mana symbols on it. So it's possible that adding the third has hugely limited how powerful and fucked up this card can be. But I'm still inclined towards saying that this card is really messed up.
Yeah, I think that when it had 2 blue symbols, it was like I obviously didn't have a tier list then, but I think my evaluation would have been around high B tier for me. And maybe in both of those it should be like A tier. But yeah, anyways, moving on.
Runic Reflections. This card's C tier. I think it's probably a little bit better than it looks because it is a cantrip that also gives you like a late game card advantage engine thing. But I just don't feel like blue decks are really missing out on late game card advantage engines. And I think the jump from 1 mana cantrip to 2 mana cantrip is pretty rough.
This is mid B for me. Or I like it as an instant speed cantrip. Especially on two, just like yeah, they didn't put something I need to counter. I'll just drop a Runic Reflections. But yeah, the fact that it doesn't bid anything is definitely something that I think makes it worse than the other cantrips. So yeah, I'll pick this up fairly often when playing blue decks, honestly. But yeah,
Yeah, it just gets cut from my blue decks often enough that I'm a
yeah,
little
that's fair.
concerned
Where
about
it's
that.
like I'll pick it up, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make the final cut. Sure.
Exactly.
The next card is Send Back, which I think that this is a card which I'm not super high on, even in the Delve mode. This is like a high C for me, and I think that also it's sort of a casualty of. I feel like if we had more tempo cards, this card would be higher on my list. But yeah, I don't know. I often find that I'm pairing blue with colors that have better or that just have better removal, and I'm picking that up. And I never find myself going like, "Oh yeah, Send Back. This is really what I want to play."
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think this card was not tuned particularly aggressively. Um, but on the other hand, I feel like I rarely end up cutting it in blue. It's just flexible removal. Even if you are like a blue-black deck, this now gives you flexible answers to artifacts, enchantments, and kind of planeswalkers. I think it's basically this will never cost you 3. It will usually cost you 2. It will sometimes cost you 1. And I've learned that bounce spells are actually just way better in cube for control decks than I'm used to them being in constructed. So yeah, this is like basically at the bottom of B, top of C for me.
Got you.
Sheltering Sphinx is so awkward because I feel like it makes the cut in a lot of decks I make, and I'm never happy about it. It's just kind of like it's a good blue 4-drop that isn't a planeswalker. So if you need a creature, or if you got really heavily cut, it just kind of ends up in a lot of your decks. But I'm just always so unhappy with it. So it's in like mid to low C tier for me.
This is a D tier card for me. I don't think it's ever made the cut. Where it's like, I feel like the devotion to blue theme doesn't quite come together, and like, if you can get this to like the point where it's giving itself hexproof, I think it's pretty damn good. But I feel like oftentimes I'm just like I like look at this and I'm like it's going to just be a 4-mana 4/4 flyer, and I feel like I can do better in this cube. So
It,
yeah.
it does have functional hexproof because it has hexproof from anything that's mana value 2 or less, which hits most things. Um,
Mhm.
it doesn't protect it from like planeswalker downticks or like murders, but a lot of the cheap removal in this cube can't touch this.
That's fair, and maybe I should be evaluating a little higher because of that. But yeah, I've just never been impressed with it, and maybe playing that will change it.
Yep. All right. Snapback Arcanist is pretty high in my B tier. I have basically never played a blue deck that doesn't want this. Sometimes you do really fucked up things with bouncing their lands, but honestly, just like it is a 2-mana instant speed way of bouncing an attacking creature is solid. You're not upset to play that in a control deck. And yeah, if you're playing a deck that can flicker things a bunch, this card's really messed up.
Yeah, no argument there.
Spellslinger Adept is high C. This card's just like a little bit screwed over by the lack of the prowess stack. I think Nova Rose Bloom made this card actually a lot better because it has vastly increased the ability for this to flashback burn spells. Um, Whereas I think before the fact that it couldn't reliably do that made it kind of awkward. But Dreadhorde Arcanist like is a good card. I've just played enough blue decks in this cube that like didn't have the instant sorcery density for me to want it to put it in B tier.
Wow, okay. For me, this is like high B tier because again, I find myself often in decks with cards that make me want to play a bunch of 1-mana cards. Again, Will Beyond Reason, Otter Slide, 100 Years of Glory, even like Peace in Our Time. And I feel like this slots in as like another really powerful way to like do what those decks are doing. And I feel like I really like that it's effectively like if you're casting a spell at sorcery speed, which I feel like in this type of deck you're usually casting at sorcery speed, you can like cast a 2-mana spell and immediately flashback it. So I feel it looks like a Dreadhorde Arcanist without any other support at first, and then it's like, oh yeah, it actually without any other support it actually flashes back 2 MV spells as well. So I've always been fairly high on this.
That's fair. Tolarian Renegade is like right at the bottom of my B tier. I've been noticing recently I've been having more and more trouble getting this to feel good because I just want to play all my instants and sorceries instead. but it's really easy to make Tolarian Renegade just like a mana war, and then it's not too hard to make it better than a mana war. You can't break it in the way that you can break Arcane Savant, which is the Conspiracy 2 card this was based on, which I love Arcane Savant, but the card does incredibly toxic things for any cube that it is legal in, so don't do that.
You don't like one card Splinter Twin?
Yeah, not a huge fan. But I think one thing that haven't seen yet, which I would love to see, is this plus Command Whimsical Dreams, where this is a Muldrifter that puts a Command Whimsical Dreams in your graveyard. That seems kind of gross. But yeah, I think this is like a low B tier for me, but I could see both it being higher or lower.
Word, this is actually a low A tier for me. I really appreciate the flexibility it offers in the sense of like, I'm totally cool picking this up early. I'm not committed to going super hard into blue. And I feel like one thing that's really annoying when I'm drafting AGC is you go to packs 2 or 3, most often 3, and you open up a piece of power that's not in your colors, and you're like, fuck. Like Temporal Gamble or like Infernal Recall or something. And I think in the best case scenario, having Tolarian Renegade is like, cool, okay, I'll just tuck this under that and I won't have to be like trying to like find fixing to like make this actually playable or whatever. But even in like the average case, I think like again, you just pick up an off-color removal spell and all of a sudden it's a Chupacabra, etc., etc. So
Yeah.
I really think I appreciate the Draft Matters cards a little bit more than maybe I should, but I still feel with Renegade, I feel that it's A tier, and I want to try and prove that when we go into actual playtesting.
I wonder if part of the reason I'm lower on this is because I just draft mana bases that ensure that I never have off-color removal.
That's fair as well. I think that I've been prioritizing lands more recently, but I feel like in player drafts, I find myself like again because I feel like there are players like you at the table where like I like all the lands are getting like sharked away, so I'm used to having to like play on more conservative mana bases. Even though when I do Cube Cobra drafts, I kind of just ignore the fact that my like mana base isn't there. But we don't talk about that.
Uh-huh.
Next up is Unbound Creativity. Um, this was a solid like C tier for me. Again, uh, well, with the situational tag, but I think that this is a little bit better because of the range of stuff it can put onto the battlefield, like creature, artifact, or enchantment. So you get to like, hey, I'm gonna just cheat out my Draconic Mastery, or I'm gonna cheat out. Actually, what big non-creature artifacts are there? I'm blanking on that, but
I don't know if there's any like really notable ones.
got you. But yeah, in general, Unbound Creativity is like another one of the cards for the cheat out deck, but it costing 1 mana less makes it a little bit awkward. So yeah.
One thing that's kind of powerful about this, deceptively so, is its ability to kind of be a flash granter. I really want to at some point try drafting like a blue-black control reanimator sort of deck where you're not planning on like, going all in on turn 2, but you're just playing a slow game where your reanimation spells are like that. But this card's just a little bit awkward to that end. I could see this card getting a slight buff. It just doesn't quite get there right now, I would argue. The next card I think is crazy underrated. So, and it's also our last card. Wow, that went by fast.
Yeah, I think that there with stuff like Cantrip, etc., we had a lot of stuff where it's like, this is good. Yeah, okay, next one.
Yeah. So Wrath of the Tides is like, I think consistently underrated when I'm drafting. I feel like a lot of people overlook how good this card is because the 4-mana mode of this card's insane. The fact that it has a base case of Bounce Your Dork and the uppercase of this is just, I'm going to cast Evacuation for 4 mana at instant speed that could also potentially bounce everyone's artifacts if I need to, is just really good. Obviously, it's a lot of density, but the card is very powerful.
Yeah, I think this is a card where I've been going higher and higher on it the more I draft, just because it's like, it's a blue rat, basically. It's it's like a bounce spell that also you can just turn into a wrath if you're heavily enough in blue. And again, the reason it's like not like anywhere close to A tier for me is because of the needing to be super heavily in blue for it to pop off. But like, I find myself in control decks where I'm like, yeah, this is just really solid. So yeah, high beach for me.
So overall, do you kind of see what I mean? Of blue has I think a higher number of A and B tier cards than white did, but just there's not a lot of cards I can look at and say this is the reason you should hard pivot into this color.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's because again, some of the best cards in blue are either enablers or they're stuff like Remake in My Image, where it's like this card is so obviously fucked up, but there's like a little more has to happen in your deck construction for this to like really pop off.
Right,
Um,
there's nothing that's Peace in Our Time, which is just like if you're playing Magic, Peace in Our Time is a fucked up card. If
yeah, yeah.
if you are drafting cheap cards, which the cube has a lot of, Divine Wisdom's a fucked up card.
I'm
Um,
surprised at how many C tiers we ended up having in here. Um,
yeah, blue. I think the like blue is suffering the second most out of any color, I would say, of just certain decks or like kind of identity stuff not being sufficiently supported. Where I think there's a lot of good blue cards that would be nuts if there was a prowess deck or if there were like random cheap blue artifacts or, anything along those lines. But just since there isn't, you're kind of stuck.
I'm really liking these reviews because I feel like I genuinely enjoy drafting AGC, but I also have rose-colored glasses a bit because I am picking the cards from the color. I'm picking the cards I enjoy and I think are good, right? And I rarely think about the cards that go to the end of the pack because by this point I'm just like glazing my eyes over them. But like thinking about them and why that's happening is like there is still room for improvement. Where like if you'd asked me like 6 months ago, I'd be like, yeah, AGC is just the best custom cube. Like, yeah, there's minor things here and there, but like, sure, whatever. And this is like, it's like all of the little things I'm like, oh yeah, huh, I wish this was better, but put in front of my eyes all at once. So yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know how that feels to hear as like the creator. If that's like motivating as like, oh yeah, we're gonna make these
No,
changes crazy, or like,
100%. It's like I never laid out the cube in the way that I've been doing with this tier maker, and it's really satisfying to get to say, wow, if I'm being honest, this card's fucking useless.
Mhm.
I'm gonna have so many. I think green is going to be like the saddest of this review series. I'm
Yeah.
not looking forward to green.
Hmm.
Just like
But
my
also, yeah,
review.
it's kind of crazy because it's like, wow, if the cube like got this big at this current state, like sky's the limit for uh once
Yeah,
the
yeah,
revision happens.
yeah. I do think I'm going to leave the cube in its current state on Plane Sculptors and just make another cube that is the updated version. Um, because I think having the historical like relic of this is important. I mean, I would have the other one like still saved somewhere, but
It would be like a version of it, yeah.
yeah, exactly. But
But
I think if someone's like, "Hey, I want to go back and draft classic Agonos cube," I think that's something I would like to be able to enable more easily.
yeah, and personally, I really appreciate that because I I'm the type of person who's like uh I think I get anal about like wanting like stuff to still be around. So especially when like the big three color card revision happened, I'm like, oh, but I wish there was still like a place where you could see stuff like Reap Fetid Remains. And Reap Fetid Remains is like my least favorite of those, but I'm still like I still have fond memories of that card, etc., etc. But yeah.
Yeah, it's still in the I have a full file which is just cards that got cut from Agonos cube. Um, which I might share in the channel at some point because there's some funny things in there. But yeah,
But yeah. So thanks everyone for watching. Actually, I it's really funny because I've been like taking breaks from editing the White episode to do other Agonos Cube related stuff. So as we speak, I would say I'm about 80% through with the editing. So by the time you hear this, I'll probably be uh, busy recording the next episodes and editing them.
Yep.
So, but until next time, this is Caillou signing off. Bye.